Good afternoon. I'm recording this on Tuesday, the 26th of November. And today, what I'm going to be doing is a video lecture where we're going to finish off Chapter 11 and then also start in on the Chapter 12 and 13 sort of combined chapter that I've designed. To finish off Chapter 11, that's our parental behavior chapter. We'll be talking about brood parasitism. And then in the second part of this lecture, we'll be then talking about social behavior, sociality, altruism. And so I'm going to be basically introducing those topics and then talking overtly about cooperative behavior with mutual benefit. And then we'll leave the rest of that chapter for next week, which is our last week of classes starting on December 3rd. So if you remember from last time, we were discussing costs and benefits at the end of class of being a discriminant parent, and this idea that adoption does happen, and that happens for probably a few times, or a few different reasons. One of which is that in many cases, it could be that the consequences of being more discriminant are actually potentially more harmful than the occasional time in which you accidentally adopt another chick or another nest mate, another offspring that is not your own, and then end up spending your parental benefits on it. So while there's certainly a cost to adoption, sort of where you are effectively wasting your resources on this adopted individual that's not a relative of yours, the costs of being really discriminate probably outweigh the benefits in most cases. Sometimes that is kind of a tough pill to swallow, and that's what we'll be talking about in this next part, which is talking about nest parasitism, though. And we sort of began this, I think I showed you a video of the cuckoo, which is probably the most famous example of this. So here's a cuckoo chick who is close to fledging, but not quite there. And this is a reed warbler that has been feeding this cuckoo chick over the course of its lifetime. And this cuckoo chick has previously killed all the reed warbler's actual chicks, or usually ejected their eggs before they even hatched. But this reed warbler kind of doesn't know the difference, and so it's treating the cuckoo as if it is its own offspring, despite the point at this point where this has become just totally ridiculous, where the cuckoo is several times the size of the adult reed warbler host bird. This over here is a picture of a cuckoo, a very young cuckoo that would have recently just hatched. And you can see they have this kind of modified area in the small of their back where they can actually use this as kind of like a shovel to help them push out the eggs of the host species. And often, not all cuckoos do this, but oftentimes cuckoos do dispose of all the other young that are in a nest when they invade. And so that way there's no competition now, and this cuckoo will be able to get all of the resources that the host bird would normally be provisioning its actual young. It's not just the cuckoo that does this. So here is a video of a honey guide, which let me flip over here. So this is actually from your behavior books website. But what you can see here, this is a honey guide bird that is directly attacking a host bird chick. And you can see it, instead of just sort of ejecting the egg, it is physically just kind of going at the thing. And ultimately, this will be a lethal encounter for this chick. The honey guide will be the one that survives and persists all throughout this time. So clearly, there's tremendous benefits to the parasitic parent. The parasitic parent, the one that laid the egg, is not going to have to provide parental care for its own offspring, so that's a substantial savings of time and energy that it can be spending foraging on its own, or laying additional eggs, or doing whatever it is that it wishes to do. The costs of the parent bird, though, of course, are huge. So oftentimes we're dealing with complete or at least partial loss of a particular clutch. In these cases, we've shown situations where the entire nest is often lost. In some other species of cuckoo, as well as some local species, like for example the brown-headed cowbird, oftentimes some of the chicks of the original host are able to survive through the process, but there's usually, because of the increased resource demand that these parasitic birds are introducing, we now have a situation where some of the host birds' chicks are unlikely to make it. Maybe they'll starve to death or otherwise will be neglected. So given that, you could certainly ask, why is it that a host bird would accept a cuckoo's egg? And you can think back to our discussion about adoption. This is really the same kind of scenario. It's just a little bit more of an insidious, sort of non-accidental thing where you have another bird trying to dupe you into raising their own offspring. So if that's true, one of the reasons why you would accept a host bird egg could just be, again, this same sort of argument we made for adoption, where sometimes it's better to have really strong parental care instincts and better to occasionally make a mistake and adopt than it is to potentially discriminate against your own offspring. So if you had a false positive, that would be where you would sort of think that you would falsely think that some of your own chicks, or this doesn't have to just be birds, this could be any other group, any other kind of animal, where you think your own offspring are actually someone else's, and so at that point you abandon them. And that's of course a major hit on your potential reproductive success, because you're basically giving up on some of your own offspring then. That can be really tough to do in a lot of these nest parasites, like the cuckoos. And there's a variety of reasons for this, particularly that selection has favored those cuckoos that are really good at mimicking the host and making it hard for them to tell their own chicks from that of others. So we talked about code breaking much earlier in the semester, and this is a prime example of code breaking, where the cuckoo is able to basically mimic the kinds of signals that the host birds typically receive from their own offspring. And so as a result, those cues elicit the same kind of, those sign stimuli elicit the same kinds of fixed action responses from the host bird, and results in them provisioning these parasitic birds. So these are our spectrograms like we dealt with in lab last week. So here is one individual chick, the spectrogram of the kinds of noises that one individual chick would make. But if you have a whole brood of chicks, this is what the whole brood of chicks would look like, where you've got numerous calls all kind of happening, sometimes they're simultaneous, oftentimes you've got multiple chicks all kind of chiming in over time. If you look at what the calls that a cuckoo chick that parasitizes these reed warblers actually sounds like, it ends up sounding much like an entire brood of reed warblers all by itself. And so in this way, it's producing much the same kind of noises that the reed warblers are used to encountering when they're encountering an entire nest full of their own offspring. And as a result, they do tend to feed these birds. Similarly, their eggs are often really good mimics too. So this is sort of over time. You can see there's actually been changes in some of the host birds. So these, the GRW birds, these are always host birds. This is from a paper I found, where the GRW eggs, they do change a bit over the years. So this is over the course of a little more than a century. But what you can see is that there typically were cuckoos that were mimicking those eggs, such that the cuckoo eggs ended up looking very much like the host bird eggs, regardless of what particular decade you happen to be sampling them from. And there's probably a bit of an arms race here, where there's certainly going to be selection that favors any host birds that can evolve an egg coloration pattern that cuckoos don't currently have, because they'll be able to identify their own eggs. But invariably what seems to happen is selection then favors cuckoos that can mimic that particular egg pattern. So here's some other pictures showing much the same thing. So the Horsfield's bronze cuckoos are these birds. So this is what the cuckoo chick looks like when it first hatches out of its egg. And here's a example of a call of that Horsfield bronze cuckoo. Here is a clutch of superb fairy wrens, and so the entire clutch basically sounds like is depicted in this spectrogram. And so what you can see is they are pretty similar to one another. They're not exactly the same, but this band here that's right around, what is that, about 8 kilohertz, and sort of warbles up and down, we see the same thing produced by the bronze cuckoo as well as by these clutch of superb fairy wrens. And so it is the case that the Horsfield's bronze cuckoo tends to get accepted in the nests of these fairy wrens when they appear. However, a shining bronze cuckoo, so this is a different species that co-occurs with these other two species. If you put a shining bronze cuckoo in a superb fairy wren's nest, these guys tend to get ejected because they don't produce, as you can see, the same kind of call. It's a little bit longer, it does warble up and down, it's slightly lower pitch, and so as a result these guys are not successful. And they'll be typically abandoned once they appear in a nest, and the host birds will go and establish some other nest rather than wasting an entire season feeding this absurd cuckoo. There are some rules that seem to occur where fairy wren parents will will often get duped by the bronze cuckoos, except in a few cases. They can sometimes figure it out if the cuckoo's egg appears after a female is completely done laying her own eggs. Sometimes they will then either eject that new egg or just abandon it, or if this new egg is appearing after the incubation period has begun. So again, in both these cases, these are basically little rules that the birds seem to evolve, the fairy wrens have evolved, that when they encounter new eggs after a certain time period, once they've gotten through their process, either they're appearing too early, so there's no eggs yet, or they've already started incubating, they've finished laying. If an egg appears during that time period, or outside of that sort of narrow window, they will be able to reject it and identify that that's a parasitic egg. But if it occurs during that period of time when the bird is laying, because the egg basically looks the same as their own eggs, and then the resulting chick that comes out sounds the same and probably has some other characteristics that are very similar to the fairy wren chicks, the fairy wrens are sort of reliably duped by this new bird. So that's one major set of explanation, or one general explanation for what's going on here. Just basically, cuckoos are extremely good mimics until it's much too late, and so the result is that the birds are fooled. There's another explanation that I've always found to be particularly fascinating, and it's called the Mafia's hypothesis, that also explains why you might have a situation where the host bird would accept an egg. And here, rather than assuming that the host bird can't tell, in this case, the Mafia hypothesis actually assumes that probably the host bird can tell that that egg is not their own, but then they accept it anyway. And the argument here is that the reason you accept a parasitic egg is that you're trying to avoid reprisals. So you're kind of making the best of a bad situation. So for example, in a different case, different kind of cuckoo, and in all these cases, you have to have a situation for this to work. You have to have a situation where the host birds still have a chance to get some of their eggs to make it through the incubation process and emerge and fledge as fully fledged adults. So in this case, we've got a different species of cuckoo that's preying upon, in this case, magpies. So the magpies are the host bird. And in a study, they found that if the magpies rejected a cuckoo's egg, their nests would suffer 87% predation rates, which means that all of their eggs would be destroyed. And the researchers weren't able to always track who was causing that, but often the assumption is that it was actually the cuckoo coming back and destroying all of the host bird's eggs that were in that nest. And you can see here's a cuckoo that's actually grabbed a egg, and oftentimes they will eat this egg. So in contrast, if the magpies allow the cuckoo egg to stay there, like I said, in this case, the cuckoo will, the chick will actually not kill all the other offspring. The birds, the magpies, will be likely to still lose an offspring or two because of the additional resources they're spending on the cuckoo, but some of their chicks might still make it under the situation. And so if they do allow the cuckoo egg to stay in their nests suffered only 12% predation. So presumably it's the cuckoo parents that are kind of checking up on their eggs. If the magpies accept, they leave all the eggs alone. If the magpies reject that cuckoo egg, then the magpies will come through and kill and destroy everything else. So if the cuckoos do come along and kill all the magpie eggs rather, that will require re-nesting, which takes additional time. It kind of pushes them out of the optimal reproduction period, and it might be the case that they won't be able to get any of their own chicks through that season. But the acceptors can still raise some of their own chicks and therefore have a slightly higher reproductive success than rejectors. Obviously, the best scenario is if you don't get parasitized at all, but this is a way that you can perhaps still make it through the season and get some reproductive success once a parasite egg appears in your nest. This is the argument anyway. The best test I've ever seen of the Mafia hypothesis is actually done in cowbirds. So here's a brown-headed cowbird, and these are birds that exist around here. They are also nest parasites. They're kind of related to blackbirds. This is the female. The male is a little bit more starkly colored with a brown head that gives them their name. A brown head and sort of a different colored body. So in this experiment, let me just try to walk through it so you can fully understand it. There were 3 different treatments, and they did this kind of artificially. They had nesting boxes. In the first kind of nesting box, after a cowbird egg was added, after a cowbird came along and laid an egg in an existing host bird's nest, the researchers would actually experimentally remove that cowbird egg. Okay, so that's treatment number one. You have a host bird in a nest box, you let a cowbird come along, and then you remove that egg. So effectively, they're sort of creating a situation in which the host bird is kind of rejecting the cowbird, even though the host bird didn't do anything. It was the researchers that removed that egg. Treatment number two is a situation where after the cowbird egg was laid, the researchers left it alone, and so the cowbird egg would be left alone within that nest and left intact. Treatment three was kind of a like treatment one. After the cowbird laid an egg in the host bird's nest, the researchers would remove that egg, but then they basically changed the opening into the nest cavity, these little nesting boxes, such that the cowbirds couldn't get back to that nest. They were still large enough for the smaller host birds to get there, but the cowbirds could not get in. So here you've got a situation, treatment one is like, this is as if the host birds rejected the egg. Treatment two is as if the host birds accepted the egg. Treatment three, the host birds rejected the egg, but the cowbirds can't do anything about it. They can't exact the sort of mafia reprisal that gives the hypothesis its name. And you can see what happened here. So under treatment one, if we look in this figure, this is showing nest predation rates. Under treatment one, when the host bird was sort of forced to reject the egg because the researchers pulled it out, there was very high nest predation rates, upwards of almost 60% nest predation. So that means that 60% of the time the nest was completely destroyed. Treatment two was a situation where you had an egg acceptor. And so in this case, the only thing that's different about these is the researchers did not remove the cowbird egg. And you can see the nest predation rate went down dramatically, only 20%. So the difference between these two, presumably under the mafia hypothesis, is that the cowbirds were attacking the nests of treatment one birds, but they were leaving the nests of treatment two birds alone because these guys were the ones that accepted this parasitic egg. Treatment three, on the other hand, is what they're showing is a situation in which the cowbird, even though the cowbird egg was removed, the cowbirds could not get back to that nest. They were protected by the smaller opening. And so under that scenario, they had dramatically lower predation rates on those nests. So this is showing predation rate. Over here, the red graph is showing warbler offspring per nest that's being produced. And you can see that there's sort of a mirror image of the nest predation rate. So if you removed the cowbird egg, even though now the cowbird parasite is not there that would mess up your nest, because of the very high predation rate, those nests typically only got about one offspring out per season. Whereas if you allow the cowbird egg to stay in your nest, these host birds, even though they're suffering some losses and it's added strain on their family, and there's a good chance that some of their chicks might starve, they're still getting about 3 offspring per nest out of that situation. That might be less than it would be under ideal conditions, but that's still decent. Treatment 3 was the case where we had no predation, or virtually no predation, because the cowbirds couldn't get back to that nest at all. And in that situation, they're still producing somewhere around 3 offspring per nest. So I think there's sort of 2 outcomes of this. I mean, one is certainly that the cowbirds seem to be responsible for the increase in predation that happens if you reject a cowbird egg. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting here is that treatment 3 is kind of the ideal situation for the bird, right? So this is the situation where there's no parasite at all, and they're not dealing with they're dealing with really low predation, and they're still only getting about 3 birds per nest out. Treatment 2 is when you have a cowbird that's still present and they're in that nest. And yet those birds are still usually able to get 3 offspring successfully reared of their own in addition to that cowbird offspring. So all of this is, I think, pretty strong support for the mafia hypothesis, at least in those situations where the cowbird or the parasite does not completely destroy instantly the moment the egg is laid. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a complete loss of your entire clutch, as we saw earlier with some of those cuckoo birds. All right, last topic in the chapter then is trying to understand how did this evolve, this brood parasitic behavior, or nest parasite behavior. How did that actually evolve? It has occurred many times in birds. It's actually not a really that rare of a phenomenon. So some of the most prolific of the nest parasites include cuckoos, and there's some studies that suggest that nest parasitism has actually evolved 3 different times in cuckoos. We just mentioned cowbirds, the brown-headed cowbirds that occur locally. There are some certain kinds of finches that are called cuckoo finches, and they're named because they pursue the same kind of lifestyle, they're nest parasites. And there's another thing called a witta, I think is how you pronounce that. So like a paradise witta, for example, that are also obligate nest parasites. So how did this behavior evolve? I think there's 2 explanations for this. It's kind of like the gradual versus sudden hypotheses. So one hypothesis would be that the birds would start by laying eggs in the nests of others of their own species, and then gradually they'd move on to working on other species. So this is basically conspecific brood parasitism first, where you start laying in your sister or maybe your neighbor's nest that's of your own species. And then later on, that species evolves the ability to do the same to other species. That's sort of the gradual hypothesis. Hypothesis 2 is that they immediately start parasitizing other species that are not their own. So this is more of an abrupt shift hypothesis. And I will tell you that depending on the group of birds that you're looking at, you'll find some cases where there's support for hypothesis 1 and some birds where there's support for hypothesis 2. So I want to quickly run through some examples supporting each of these. In terms of the gradual shift hypothesis, we know of somewhere around about 200 species of birds that do lay their eggs in conspecific nests. So they do demonstrate some degree of nest parasitism. It's usually kind of a tactic. It's something that a bird can do kind of on the sly in addition to raising its own chicks. In some cases, it might be your only option. So for example, in wood ducks, here's a picture of a wood duck. They are cavity nesters, and you can see here's a wood duck nesting in a cavity within a tree trunk. There's relatively limited numbers of those cavities. And so as a result of having limited numbers of those cavities, females have to compete for those nests. And so those that do not successfully secure their own nest, their only option in many cases is to sneak into the nests of other birds and then lay their eggs in that bird's nest. In fact, sometimes when a female takes over a particular nest, she'll start laying more or less right away, and she may not be able to distinguish or doesn't choose to distinguish somehow her own offspring from those of the female that she just ousted. Again, other times you'll have other, while she might be out foraging, you'll have other females sneaking in, depositing an egg and running. So that is a form of nest parasitism, where they are basically causing some other bird to raise their own offspring. In the case of the wood ducks, it might be some female's only chance at getting any reproductive success, though, if they're unable to get their own cavity. We see similar kinds of things in American coots, as well as a wide variety of other birds, where you'll have these females that will sneak in and deposit eggs in their own in nests that are not their relatives, but they're neighbors, but they are of the same species. You can also do some comparative work looking at the evolution of this trait in some of the more overt nest parasites. So for example, the brown-headed cowbirds, there was a study looking at not just the brown-headed cowbird, and here's a phylogeny showing this. This is Molothrus adder. That is your brown-headed cowbird that does occur locally, but also looking at nest parasitism in some of its neighbors. So these are congeners, so these are all the same genus. I know this one is showing a different genus, but this is basically one big monophyletic group. They're all basically related to one another. And so a prediction you'd make, if the gradual hypothesis is true, that you should see gradually a situation where while the obligate nest parasite may prey upon a variety of host species, you should see their ancestors are preying upon a limited number of species, or maybe even just preying upon their own species. And the reason, this does make a lot of sense. So if you're laying your eggs in the nests of some other bird that's of your own species, your chick is going to have the exact same sort of nutritional requirements that their chicks would have. And so by laying in that nest, you're very likely provisioning, or the host will be provisioning your chick with exactly what it needs to survive. Whereas if you lay in the nest of a different species, there may actually be species differences in terms of the nutrition that they will receive, and it could be suboptimal nutrition for those birds. So again, if you look in cowbirds, you actually do see this kind of a pattern where here again is the brown-headed cowbird. Here are all these relatives, and they sort of represent a monophyletic group. And if you go through and look within the various mellothrus birds, what you end up seeing is that this more distant relative, Mellothrus rufaxillaris, really only parasitizes one other species. And in fact, I think this is indicating that they're parasitizing only within this species. So there's only one species that's parasitized, their own. Whereas Scadaifa here, this bird parasitizes 7 different species. Mellothrus aeneus parasitizes 71 species. Mellothrus bonoridis parasitizes 176. And then finally, again, our Mellothrus ater, our brown-headed cowbird, parasitizes about 216 different host species of birds. And so this is indicative of kind of a gradual increase where the ancestral bird probably was just parasitizing conspecifics, and they've gradually increased the number of birds that they're parasitizing over time. Now, alternatively, there is also support in some other cases for an abrupt evolution of nest parasitism. So some of this is more of sort of a logical argument where we're not dealing with obligate nest parasites, but one finding that is sort of supportive that actually might be beneficial to switch directly into a different species and start parasitizing them rather than starting with a conspecific is that if you start with especially a smaller species that you start parasitizing, your chicks will have an unfair advantage against those small chicks when you lay them in the nest of a smaller species. So this was a study that was done in great tits versus blue tits. You might remember we actually did this, looked at great tits versus blue tits when we were talking earlier this semester about some of the signals that birds learn in the nests of their host birds. So this was an example where we talked about imprinting and imprinting on a certain nest, or imprinting on the songs of host birds. But this was a study that was done actually looking at nestling survival. And so what they did is that they would artificially add either blue tit or great tit eggs into the nests of either blue tits or great tits. And so if you sort of go through and look at the different bars here, in all cases they're looking at nestling survival. This first one, they took a blue tit chick and they placed it in the nest of a blue tit host. So this is basically a conspecific parasitism. And then over at the far end over here on the right, this is where they took a great tit egg and they placed it in the nest of a great tit host, and then they tracked its survivorship. So these are kind of two controls looking at conspecific parasitism. And then over here, they're looking at what happens if you take a blue tit chick egg and place it in the nest of a great tit host. The blue bar here is when you take a great tit chick and place it in the nest of a blue tit host. And you can see that there's one bar that's dramatically different from all the others, and that is where you have a blue tit egg that's placed in the nest of a great tit host. So as you can sort of imagine, the reason great tits are called great tits is because they're pretty large relative to other of the titmice and other sorts of individuals. This is a large bird relative to the blue tit. The blue tit is more like the size of a chickadee, whereas great tits are getting to be a little bit bigger than that. And so that corresponds also then to the size of their nestlings. Blue tit chicks, when they hatch in the nest and they're surrounded by all these gigantic great tit chicks, they do not do very well, and they have very poor survivorship. They only survived a little less than 10% of the time. Whereas in contrast, if a great tit egg was placed in a blue tit host nest, then in those situations, the great tits actually did quite well. They did just as well as if they were placed in a conspecific. And so the argument here is that the blue tit was at a tremendous disadvantage due to its size, whereas the great tit was at least equal, if not at a bit of an advantage, by being in a nest with a bunch of smaller blue tit chicks. So again, the argument here is that if you're able to start parasitizing an unrelated host species that is smaller than you, your chicks may have an advantage from a ability in terms of their ability to grow faster and outcompete the other chicks that are within that same nest. And there's also phylogenetic evidence that seems to support this abrupt shift nest evidence. So this is a study that was done in Viduas. So these are not in cuckoos, but they are also parasitic. And what you can see if you look across this phylogeny, the common ancestor would be kind of coming in right in here of all of these different birds that are listed. These blue lines are all the obligate nest parasites. So these are the ones that absolutely must be nest parasites. They do not raise their own chicks at all. There's one other group that's found over here. These are also obligate nest parasites. So we have sort of two branches of this tree where you have obligate nest parasitism that has evolved. If the gradual parasitism hypothesis is correct, hypothesis 1, then we would expect that their common the ancestor of these obligate nest parasites probably should be intraspecific nest parasites, and that we would have to go back into further ancestors before we would find non-parasitic ancestors, which seems to be the ancestral condition across this entire group. But that's not really what we see, right? Instead, we see kind of abrupt changes where here, if you follow this Vidua line and go back here, all these birds are obligate nest parasites, but their nearest common ancestor that is not an obligate nest parasite was probably not parasitic at all. It was not an intraspecific parasite based on the reconstruction of this phylogeny, and this is based on a parsimony analysis. Similarly, down here you've got these two other groups, including a Molothrus group. So this is the Molothrus, that's the cowbirds. This is not our cowbird. This is one of those other four species. But these guys are found here. The nearest common ancestor that is not part of the group is a junco, and these juncos are not parasitic either. The intraspecific nest parasitism is occurring in different groups within this large phylogeny. So there's not evidence in this phylogeny, at least, of there being sort of a gradual increase in nest parasitism that was occurring. So as I said, in some species we do have support for a gradualistic explanation. In other species we do not have support for a gradualistic explanation. So it's sort of an unresolved problem, and it's probably one of these situations where in some species it was gradual, and in other species it was abrupt. But it does give you a feel for the work that's been done to try to reconstruct how these behaviors have evolved. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause here with the recording. And then I'll be recording basically the first 8 or so slides of the next chapter as a way to sort of introduce that chapter and get us off to a good start, so we will have enough time to cover everything at a nice clip and do a case study to sort of finish off our semester at the end of next week.